Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today, let's go to Moscow. And we have a very special treat in Moscow. Those of you who remember a certain name, like Mikhail Gorbachev, will also remember that his best in the world interpreter was Pavel Palazhchenko, who is in Moscow and is going to talk to us today. And he has a new book out. So I'm going to try to entice him to tell us all of the most juicy contents of his memoir, which is the second memoir that he has published. There's another one that was called My Years with Gorbachev and Shevardnadze. And I just got it off the shelf this morning to look at it again. It's full of little sticky notes, like 50 sticky notes sticking out of the back of that book, as I read it very carefully in those days, but that was a while ago. Good morning, Pavel. Oh, it's evening for you. Hi, anyway.
Yeah, it's evening. It's 8:30 p.m. in Moscow.
Uh-huh. All right. Well, it's just noontime for us. So
Yeah.
we're going to have a conversation about your new book, I hope, which I have not read. And I would love to read it. I hope I have an opportunity to read it in English. But let's talk about when did it come out? What is the title? How can people get it? And I will put all that information at the end so people can look at the title page at the end and get the facts about how they can obtain a copy.
Yeah. Well, the book is in Russian, indeed. It has, in terms of the substance, a lot of parallels with the book that you read in English. And that one was published, almost a century ago in 1997. And it was published in the US by Penn State Press, to whom I'm very grateful for working with me to publish that book. It was a very, very interesting process. I wrote the book in English, and my editor was actually happy with the book. She said there is very little to revise, very little to edit. And so the book was published fairly soon after the events it describes. It's basically a blow-by-blow account of what I saw, particularly during the period of 1985 to 1981, when I was working with the two protagonists, Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, two persons whom I very much respect. And it is still in print, and it's still on Amazon.com. So anyone
It's a juicy read, too.
It's a juicy read. Okay, thanks a lot. Anyone who'd like to take a look is welcome. But this book that I published about a year ago, the first printing, the first edition was about a year ago. This book is in Russian. It is written for basically the Russian-speaking audience. It's a little different. It's a little more subjective. It's a little more personal. There's a little more about my life, about how I came about working for the Soviet government and then for Mikhail Gorbachev and Eduard Shevardnadze, what I actually saw. But also there's a little more in the book about what I learned afterwards, because we have an excellent archive in the Gorbachev Foundation that contains a lot of information, that contains the memorandums of conversation, basically transcripts of Gorbachev's conversations with foreign leaders, not just the English-speaking leaders whose conversations I interpreted and then recorded, but also conversations with people like Francois Mitterrand, Helmut Kohl, and particularly in connection with the very controversial subject of German unification and NATO enlargement. I also used the material from the archive. And therefore, it is a little different from the English version, from my English language memoirs. But I must say, that writing it, I saw that generally most of my memories and most of my assessments of what happened during those years have not really changed. There's some additional detail, there is some additional reflection and analysis, but basically, I still remain where I was so far as my evaluation of what happened at that time is concerned.
Mhm, mhm. Well, that's a very important question. Whether or not events have made you reconsider any of the decisions you made or your conclusions you reached at that time. I wonder if you could even hazard a guess about how much Mr. Gorbachev would also say the same things if he were asked today.
Well, I would say that he would be somewhat different on some of the events and some of his decisions so far as the domestic developments are concerned in the Soviet Union. But so far as foreign policy, I think that his overall evaluation and his overall position has not really changed.
Mhm.
He is constantly asked about what he thinks about some of the domestic issues and some of the domestic decisions that he made. And over the 30 years that he has spent out of government as a private citizen, as a former president, I think he has developed a narrative that is, on the one hand, very convincing so far as the main things are concerned, but at the same time, that is critical of some of the decisions that he took, and that I wouldn't say that he blames himself for those decisions, but I think that he looks at them kind of more historically.
Oh, okay. With regret. Which
With
ones?
some regret, but also I think with an analytical mind.
Uh-huh.
I look at them also with an analytical mind, and I happen to be less critical and more charitable on some of those decisions, even than Gorbachev is today.
Really? Uh-huh.
Yeah.
In what way? I mean, what are the issues that you think he's moved his opinions about?
Well, for example, he believes that it would have been better for him to start reforming the Communist Party earlier than he actually did, or to start reforming the Union of Republics again earlier than he did.
Mm-hmm.
My feeling is that perhaps had he done so, had he started to really tinker with the the kind of communist party that he inherited, then we perhaps might have had the attempted coup even earlier than
Oh,
we had, not in August 1991, but perhaps even earlier. So you never know. But, the fact that he still is very analytical about what happened during those years is really very interesting. He published an article, an essay, about 40 pages essay called uh, Perestroika and New Thinking, a Retrospective, and you can find it on the English language website of the magazine Russia in Global Affairs.
okay.
I think it's easy to find if you Google it. So the
Uh,
English translation is on that website, and that's where he really gives his current, up-to-date assessment of what happened, both domestically and internationally. And I think it will be a good read for your audience because it
when,
is very, very analytical, and it's like what he thinks 30 years afterward.
how long ago did he write it?
It was published, I think, less than a year ago,
I see.
And as I say, it's very easy to Google. You just Google Russia in global affairs, Gorbachev, maybe even the title
Mm.
of the piece. It's called, again, Perestroika and New Thinking, a retrospective by Mikhail Gorbachev. So it's easy to find. And as I said, it's quite analytical. And, when I was translating it into English, I thought that perhaps he was a little too self-critical in in
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
essay. Yeah.
Well, I would always be very lenient toward that man because he's my hero of all time, practically. Okay, listen, one of the only times that I would have thought that uh, most people thought he made a mistake even at the time, and I wonder what he would say now and what you would say, was this period toward the end when he so-called made the turn to the right, when he put a lot of faith in some of these dinosaurs and gave them too much power, and then went away and left them more or less free to do their mischief. Um, at the time, I mean, a number of people who had really loved him dearly. I remember talking with Georgy Arbatov, who was pretty sore at the time. So he'd put his trust in the wrong people for a while, I think. What would he say about that now, and what did you think at the time?
Well, interestingly, that is not the decision or the moment where he is critical about the decisions that he made.
Really?
And I'll explain why. Yeah, and Arbatov, I admire the man, but I think that Arbatov would have done better to actually support Gorbachev when the practically, the 80% of the Russian intelligentsia, of the Russian intellectuals, fled from Gorbachev in favor of Yeltsin. And I think that was not Gorbachev's mistake. That was the mistake of the Russian intelligentsia, who believed that the more radical approach espoused by Yeltsin would work better for Russia and for the country as a whole. To me, that was a big mistake on the part of the Russian intelligentsia. Fortunately, Arbatov himself did not flee. He did not. He was not one of those people who actually pledged allegiance to Yeltsin, but he could have done more to support Gorbachev at that very, very difficult period. Actually, what the pro-Yeltsin faction of the Russian intelligentsia, and I think it was a majority of the Russian intelligentsia at that time,
Yeah.
particularly high status Russian intelligentsia, what they were blaming Gorbachev for was that he was not in favor of the radical, the kind of crash economic reform that Yeltsin at that time was espousing without really looking into it. He was
Yeah.
not looking into the possible consequences of the kind of economic radicalism that he was proposing. So I think that actually, at the most difficult moment in Gorbachev's life, political life, I actually took my own decision that was opposite to what most of my friends were thinking, and that is I decided to actually work with Gorbachev, and I took him up on his proposal to move from the foreign ministry to his executive office. And I frankly think that knowing what to do now about the kind of consequences that this economic radicalism had for our country, the kind of misery and hardship for ordinary people that resulted from the crash economic reform, from the economic radicalism, and what did they call it? They called it, I think, oh my, I forget what they called
Shock
it.
therapy.
Shock therapy, exactly.
Yeah.
And
Right.
how, the people of Russia and other republics suffered from the shock therapy approach to economic reform. knowing all that, I think actually Gorbachev was right. Not Arbatov, not
I
most of the,
totally,
not
yeah.
most of my friends who believed that, the more radical it is, the better it is, and they were promising, Yeltsin was promising that within a couple of years, Russia will flourish, Russia will prosper, and market economics will prevail and make Russia one of the biggest dynamos in the world economy. That did not happen. They also believed that, if Russia goes its own ways without the burden of the other republics, very quickly Russia will prosper and will become so powerful that all the other republics will actually crawl to Russia, will actually, run to rejoin Russia and ask for help, and they will basically become dependent on the Russian Federation. That did not happen. And that's why there is so much trauma today in Russia, because none of the promises of Boris Yeltsin and of the radical intelligentsia that supported him, none of them were fulfilled.
Well, absolutely. I didn't mean to counterpoint those two positions, because I didn't realize that I still don't get it. Why? Because there was what I agree was, at the time, I thought was a stupid turn toward Yeltsin. Everybody I knew in Moscow was thinking the way you've described them, very much leaving just a total turnover from within the party. People who had been very conservative and conventional, within minutes became flaming radicals. And then many people then blamed the U.S. Well, actually, they should have blamed Jeffrey Sachs for promoting the shock therapy thing. But at any rate, I think they assumed that the U.S. was behind all of these innovative economic policies and was in favor of Yeltsin. But certainly the people I knew were not. The Americans I knew still very, very enthusiastic about Gorbachev. But to me, that still doesn't explain to me why he not only didn't just hold his ground, but he moved to the right and gave more power to these old guard types.
Well, again, that is not something that he is blaming himself for. I would say that it was not so much his moving to the right as the left actually deserting him totally. And he was kind of left with the kind of people that surrounded him and that mostly belonged to the kind of Soviet old guard. He had to work with the Soviet old guard. Had he not, tried to work with the Soviet old guard, I think it would have been impossible even to start the reforms. He had to persuade them, he had to co-opt them, and he was successful in that regard up until 1989, 1990. He was quite successful in either co-opting them or neutralizing them. But then when things became difficult, and there were, I accept, there were real differences about the pace of economic reforms. Yes, absolutely. Perhaps there were possibilities to move somewhat faster on economic reforms in Russia and the other republics. But for that, the precondition, I think, was cooperation between Gorbachev and Yeltsin. Yeltsin, who was becoming increasingly popular. And I think it was the challenge for the politically active people in Russia, for the politically active intelligentsia in Russia, to work in that direction, to make sure that there is cooperation between Yeltsin and Gorbachev. Instead, what they were doing, they were actually increasing the gap between Gorbachev and Yeltsin. They were actually pushing Yeltsin to become even more radical. And Yeltsin literally wallowed in the kind of popularity that he had among those radicals. And when the intellectuals deserted Gorbachev, Gorbachev was left with
Mm,
the kind of people who were around him, the people who were really closest to him, like his assistant for foreign affairs, Anatoly Chernayev, Georgy Shakhnazarov, who helped him to develop the draft Union Treaty that was supposed to be signed on August the 20th, 1991. Some other people, they remained close to him. They did not desert him, and they were certainly not among the plotters of the August putsch and the August coup. The people who actually organized the August coup, yes, they were part of Gorbachev's circle, but not Gorbachev's inner circle. They were the legacy that he inherited, like the Minister of Defense, the chairman of the KGB. They were the people representing their institutions, the institutions that probably would have ceased to exist or would have been radically transformed after the Union Treaty would have been signed.
mhm,
And they did not want it. And they believed that by shutting out Gorbachev as they did in August, they would save the Soviet Union or some kind of union. In fact, of course, the consequences were totally different. So again, going back to where Gorbachev believes he did not do the thing that would have been best for him and for the country, you have to go back as far as 1987. And that's a far more interesting period when there were proposals about changing the price system. Changing the price system within the socialist economy that Gorbachev inherited. The system was totally skewed. The system was not sustainable for any kind of economy. And Gorbachev was willing to take unpopular decisions about changing the price system that would have made a lot of people unhappy. I mean, there were ideas about how to adjust it so that the people with the lowest income would not suffer from, for example, raising the price of bread and other essential goods and products. So Gorbachev considered that. He put that question to the Politburo, and the Politburo was not in favor. So Gorbachev is now saying that he should have insisted on that change because changing the price system, even within the old socialist economy, would have made it easier to then reform the economy and move toward a freer market and private property. I think that he is right. That was a mistake. He did not show enough political will in order to start that change that would have created ground for then moving to a freer economy and ultimately to market economics. So he is quite critical about some of those things. For example, also he is saying that, when because of the huge money overhang over the economy, people had a lot more money than there were goods on the market. He says, in 1991, I should have taken the decision to cut defense spending, despite probable resistance from the defense sector, and buy consumer goods and products from the West in order to kind of saturate the market so that people would have been able not to stand in line and buy the kind of goods for which there was so much hunger in the Soviet economy. Again, people had the money, but there was nothing on the shelves of the stores.
mm,
Again, reconsidering, that situation, he believes that he should have done what he decided at that time not to do. But talking about his mistakes, his perhaps blunders and errors, you should remember, the kind of situation in which he was. That was an attempt to try and change a system that was extremely rigid, politically, economically, that was based on vested interests in the economic bureaucracy, in the Communist Party, in the political system, that were extremely difficult to even try to overcome. So the fact that he was able to engineer the kind of turnaround in the Soviet system that he actually did, to institute the freedoms and rights, individual rights that were non-existent before he came to power. That fact alone, I think, kind of overrules all the complaints and all the criticisms that we can legitimately have.
Well, as a peace worker, that's the thing that stands out to me is that he totally changed international affairs during the time when he had the authority to do it. And I remember the last pages of your book seemed to reflect mostly his desire to his hope that the most important changes that he'd put into place would remain, that not everything would be lost. All of the reforms that he'd created, some of them would remain. And I wonder right now, can anybody say that there's anything left from what he achieved? It is such a disappointment now to see what's happening in Russia. In fact, not just in Russia, but the whole rest of the world. That those days seem like golden years in a way.
Well, definitely internationally, we are at a moment of crisis. There is no question about it. Nevertheless, I do think that a lot of what Gorbachev did will ultimately prevail. And that's of course, a big question mark today. You can say that it's just, my optimism that I learned from Gorbachev. He's always been an optimist, and one of his books is called I Remain an Optimist. But I do think that when people say that there is this second Cold War, I think they're really mistaken, because if you look at the first Cold War, first of all, it was extremely ideological. It was based on ideological dogma. It was based on two systems, political, socio-economic, and ideological systems, and that is not the case today. Secondly, if you look at the kind of arms race that we witnessed during particularly the high point of the Cold War, and that's from mid 1960s to mid 1980s. If you look at the kind of Cold War, if you look at the kind of numbers reflecting the arsenals that were created and built at that time, and compare with those numbers with what we have today, you'll see that the arms race was absolutely staggering, and that there is nothing like this today. There is a kind of qualitative competition, which I don't know whether we should call an arms race, but maybe we can call it a qualitative arms race. But there is nothing like the numbers of weapons that were built during those 2 decades of the real Cold War. And finally, I also believe that whereas during the Cold War, you had the confrontation between the Soviet Union and the West, in practically every region of the world, you don't have that. We do have difficult situations, let's say in Syria. We have, of course, this crisis and currently centered on Ukraine and centered on Russia's desire to revisit the entire European security system. But it's nothing like what they had during the Cold War. Because during the real Cold War, when you look at the Middle East, you look at Afghanistan, you look at Latin America, Nicaragua, the entire Central American region, you look at practically every region of the world, including, for example, Southern Africa, and everywhere it's America on one side, the West on one side, and the Soviet Union on the other side of the fence. We don't have that, even though we do have not just difficulties, but the current very difficult crisis. So I would say that a lot of what Gorbachev was able to achieve is still there.
Mhm.
If you look at even in Europe, if you, which is dangerous, I accept, but if you look in Europe, for example, you know, the number of American nuclear weapons at the height of the Cold War in Europe was like 7,000 warheads. And
Mhm.
now it's 200 bombs at various bases in 4 or 5 countries. And that's it.
Yeah.
So even numbers wise, it's very different. There were, you know, in Europe, nuclear landmines, there were nuclear howitzers, there was nuclear air defense, thousands of weapons. We now have the German army that is about 1/3 in terms of personnel that it was during the Cold War. So don't forget about those achievements. Don't forget about those accomplishments. You really cannot say that all is lost. And frankly, I don't believe that the current crisis will last forever. I think that there are ways to exit
Okay, well,
from this
let's
crisis.
go to that. I want to talk to you about the current thing as well, but I'm thinking also in terms of domestic policies. I mean, Putin is such the antithesis of Gorbachev that I wonder if you look at you know, Russia as it was becoming a real democracy, you know, and I don't see that now. Do you? Any remainder of that within?
Well, there are certainly remainders of democracy in Russia. There are still remnants of the free press, and particularly on the radio, less so on television, but particularly on the radio and in some newspapers, you do see actually a free flow of information and analysis. But I agree, you know, it's not what we expected. It's not what we were hoping for 30 years ago. In terms of democracy, in terms of political democracy, I'm not happy with what we have, for example, in the State Duma. But there is still, I think, among many people in Russia, a belief that, you know, elections is a better way than actually people deciding for you who will represent you. And during the recent elections in some parts of Moscow, you know, the counting of the votes, I don't believe in some of the numbers, but I do see that candidates representing, let's say, the opposition or the political parties or themselves personally who disagree with many of the policies of the current government, they were able to do quite well. And those are people, many of them young people, many of them working at the municipal level, which is very important, many of them trying to develop local democracy. The Russian society is changing in a better direction than the Russian political system. And
Really?
that too is something that is the inheritance that we still have from Gorbachev. There are more people who think freely, even though they're not always able to do something about it. than 20 or 30 or 40 years, certainly than 40 years ago. So while being critical about what we see today in Russia politically, you shouldn't really exaggerate. You know, if you look at Russia today and Russia during the height of the communist period, those are two different countries. You may not like everything in the current Russia, in Russia today, but those are really two different countries. And obviously, you know, many of my friends, for example, have been kind of co-opted into the system. But even among them, I see a yearning, you know, a desire for a different situation, for opportunities to act in a freer way to improve the country, to improve society. Unfortunately, quite a few people have had to leave. And that's something that I believe is one of the most unfortunate parts of it. Because, you know, when people have to go to Poland or to Ukraine or to the US, because they believe that they could be subject to perhaps persecution, some kind of legal thing that they believe would be unfair. That's really unfortunate, because I believe that those people could be very useful for Russia and for its future.
Mm-hmm. And if you were to put your bets on the most promising way forward for Russia now, I mean internally, a political move that would unsettle the Putin regime and make a turn in the direction that you would favor, where would you put your bets? Would you favor Navalny, or is it, what kind of alternative movement is possible?
Well, I don't think that the goal should be to unsettle the Putin regime. I believe that there are still opportunities for the system to begin to change. In what way that's going to happen, I don't know. But I do believe that there is a kind of interconnection between domestic politics and international affairs. And so if, you know, the current crisis in relations between Russia and the West were to subside and some way found to move forward, I think that would create a better situation for those people who, as I said, are activists at the local level, at the municipal level, for the new generation that would start to come in and do what's possible. I think that in Russia, during periods of coexistence and relative peace globally, in Russia, things were also going better domestically. So I admire Navalny's courage. I do believe that he will probably be able to survive the ordeal that he is going through now. But at the same time, I don't think that you should pin your hopes on any one person. You should pin your hopes on destabilization, or you should pin your hopes on some unexpected event that will change things overnight or very quickly. I do believe in a gradual process. I do believe that people will again turn to some kind of a more organic system that is not based on the decisions of a relatively small group of people and all the others basically acquiescing. This is the kind of system that we have now, but I don't think it's really sustainable. So my hope is that the change that ultimately is inevitable will not be a crash, and will not be a bang, but will be a more or less gradual system. That's my hope. I don't know whether it will be fulfilled, but it's my hope.
Well, would you even entertain the possibility that Putin could be mollified enough to change course? In other words, if somebody were to buy him off by giving him whatever he wants regarding Ukraine, and that could take various forms, I think that's worth talking about. But if he really was fixated on the security of Russia, and you can make an argument that in fact NATO isn't exactly being very helpful in that, then maybe could he relax on some of the other issues and relent a little bit on persecuting people and so on?
Well, that's an excellent question, but it's a question to which I really do not have an answer. So far as Ukraine is concerned, the really unfortunate thing that has been happening over the past years is that I now have to predict that a relationship with Ukraine will continue to be extremely difficult for years and decades to come. You know, the parallel that I can draw is probably relations between India and Pakistan, where India is definitely a stronger power, a bigger power, where Pakistan has grievances against India, but where you cannot see any kind of positive prospect for any kind of foreseeable future. And that's extremely unfortunate because, you know, those are almost a couple of billion people. And they are in a relationship that is at times even dangerous, given that both countries have nuclear weapons. So unfortunately, relations between Russia and Ukraine will continue to be difficult. I think what you're suggesting, like mollifying Russia by giving Russia at least something that it wants in Ukraine, that's probably not the way forward. What I think is possible is to try to work out some political understanding that would be based on the status quo. And the status quo is that it is unrealistic for anyone, including the Ukrainian people and the leaders of Ukraine, to think that it will become a member of NATO in the foreseeable future. Mm-hmm. So why not go to some kind of political memorandum of understanding that would reflect that? Not necessarily set it in stone for decades to come, but basically reflecting the actual situation and asking everyone to be realistic about that. So
how about just
to me, that would be the best way forward. But
how about declaring Ukraine a neutral state? And I don't know how Austria became institutionalized permanently, more or less, as a neutral country, but it would be something like making a Ukraine into an Austria.
The post-Stalinist Soviet leadership decided that keeping forces, the Soviet armed forces in Austria, would not be a sustainable situation for what they thought could be developing a more normal relationship with the West. And so it was the decision of the entire Soviet leadership that the best way forward would be the state treaty with Austria that would make Austria permanently neutral. And I think the West very wisely jumped at that. So both sides at that time showed wisdom. Unfortunately, I believe that the possibility for that kind of treaty was perhaps wasted, was perhaps missed years and years ago. If that had been possible, that was like decades ago, a couple of decades ago. So that would not be the way forward. In my view, for Russia to persuade Ukraine to be content with the current status quo would, and that is that, the possibility of becoming a member of NATO is nowhere in sight. For Russia to persuade Ukraine about that would be extremely difficult today. It would require, number one, a lot of secret, quiet diplomacy. It would also require a lot of wisdom on the part of Ukrainian leadership to persuade their own society that that would work best. And it would also require some way of working either within the Minsk agreements or around the Minsk agreements to make sure that there is some kind of at least cultural autonomy for the people. At least there are many of the people in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions who actually would love to become part of Russia, but who could perhaps be persuaded with, as I said, a lot of political will and wisdom and a lot of quiet and secret diplomacy to be part of Ukraine with some guarantees of, as I say, at least cultural autonomy. Many people in Russia believe that people in Donetsk and Luhansk, had been prohibited from speaking Russian, and that is not the case. When I visited Ukraine 4 or 5 years ago in Kiev, a lot of people still speak Russian, even though education is currently all in Ukrainian. There is a lot of Russian culture around, both high culture and popular culture. So you cannot say really that Ukraine is pressuring Russian-speaking people, but many people in Russia believe that. So in order to find some accommodation, it would require a lot of work in both countries. And that I do not see happening.
Right.
So unfortunately, I have to be pessimistic about that. But I do believe that at least the current aggravation of the crisis could be overcome so that at least some possibilities for quiet work aimed at least a medium-term perspective could start. But it's extremely difficult. As I said, I learned from Gorbachev to be always an optimist, but this is not where I can confidently say that I'm optimistic. Sorry
Okay,
about
now
that.
we talked a little bit about the East, the Donbass situation, which is now the hot area. But from the point of view of the Western countries, NATO and all the others, the thing goes back to the Crimea change. And as I understand it, Gorbachev was not opposed to that. And I wonder what your view is. It seems to me that even if you could just accomplish everything you just suggested about giving more autonomy to those Luhansk and Donetsk and so on, that there would still be the lingering sanctions and suspicions and hostility resulting from the Crimean takeover. And in the West, even if you settled the hot issue right now.
Well, it's a very reasonable question, but let me remind you that the sanctions that were instituted right after the takeover of Crimea were relatively mild, both on the part of the US and on the part of the West as a whole. And therefore, if there is some solution, and again, I'm not particularly optimistic about that, but if there is some solution on Donetsk and Luhansk, then I think that a return to the relatively soft sanctions that were imposed after the Crimea, that would be possible. That would be possible. On the other hand, of course, we do have a problem, and that is that no Russian government will ever even consider giving Crimea back to Ukraine, and no Ukrainian government, whoever, even the current opposition that is kind of pro-Russian, no Ukrainian government will ever be able to say, forget about Crimea, we concede it's Russia. And that, to me, as a person who has some Ukrainian blood in my veins, I can tell you that, for me, is the real drama, because that will be a thorn in the Russian-Ukrainian relationship for years and decades to come. But again, we do have, countries that have been able to live with that and have been able to relate, have been able to be, if not friends, but at least to be in a normal relationship. So perhaps, setting aside the Crimea for any foreseeable future would be a realistic solution, would be a realistic decision. I'm not happy saying that, I'm not happy saying that probably that'll be a thorn in the relationship for decades to come, but that's how things are.
Mm-hmm. I don't know whether your new book repeats what you put in the previous book, but you're in a way in a position to make comments again that are historically important about the conversation. Was it in Malta, where Baker made this promise not to move to the east 1 inch? And I think
but that was not in Malta. That was in Moscow, and that was in February 1990, and that was entirely in the context of German unification. You really cannot argue that in any way assumed any kind of promise or possibility for other countries that were still part of the Warsaw Pact being part of that promise. It was what he did say, and he said the military infrastructure of NATO would not move 1 inch after German unification. And that was at a time when Gorbachev was opposed not to unification, but to united Germany being in NATO. It was only in that context that phrase was uttered. And obviously, had Gorbachev said, that's very interesting. Now give me a promise that NATO will never expand, that NATO will never include any of the countries that are now part of the Warsaw Pact or even part of the Soviet Union. That would have been absurd. That would have been grotesque. It's the current narrative of anti-Gorbachev people that he could have required such a promise. But well,
I'm sorry, I'm one of those, and I'm certainly not an anti-Gorbachev person. But all along, I've thought, he really messed up that time. He should have put it in writing.
How come? What could have been put in writing that NATO actually abandons its own treaty, its own founding document, and is no longer an organization open to other countries? What kind of US Senate would have approved such a treaty, had it been a treaty? or even a political statement that NATO has decided to be a closed organization that will only include the countries that were part of NATO as of what, 1990? That wouldn't have been possible. Gorbachev would have been ridiculed had he asked for that. And remember, they started blaming Gorbachev for not doing that. In 1996, 1997, if Russia wanted to extract that kind of promise from NATO or from the US, it could have actually done that. It could have done that when the Russian troops were still in East Germany and were still in Poland, in other countries. It didn't do that. And I think that was quite reasonable because it would never have been able to get any kind of promise, any kind of legal instrument that would have affirmed that. That was simply not possible. It would have been an embarrassment for either Gorbachev or the Russian government to raise this possibility because it was not a possibility. It was not really a possibility. You cannot change the Washington Treaty that says other countries can become members of NATO. You cannot ratify that change in the US Senate and the Senates and the parliaments of other countries. That was not possible then. It's not possible now. You have to be realistic about that.
No, I'm not.
You have to be realistic about that.
I would have to say, I guess at that time, I was even more ambitious than that. I would have wanted to totally disband NATO. When they were talking about disbanding the WTO, I thought, well, that's fine. Let's do both sides. But obviously, you would think that I'm totally unrealistic if I'd ever said things like that. What would have been
the Warsaw Treaty, when the Warsaw Treaty ceased to exist, obviously NATO kind of lost its meaning to some extent.
Yeah.
And it was for them an extremely difficult process to try and find some other purpose for NATO. And that was a period when perhaps some kind of a different European security arrangement could have been found, like, let's say, in 1992, early 1993. That was when Eastern European countries to become members of NATO. That was a brief window of opportunity when perhaps that could have been tried. But it would have required enormously creative diplomacy. It would have required a different kind of leadership. It would have required a lot of wisdom of a kind that was not available at that time.
We didn't talk very much about your book.
The book is going very well. The third printing is almost has almost been sold out, and there'll be a fourth printing in March. And I'm glad that there is interest both in Russia, but also among Russian speakers in all kinds of countries like the US, Israel, and other countries. It's something that I think any author likes to see.
But it's not just Russian speakers. Why in the world aren't you going to publish it in English? Please.
Well, that is that's an interesting idea because the book is somewhat different from the one I published in '97, and that is still in print. But you'll have to look for the publisher. You have to think about the translation, whether it should be myself who would do the translation or someone else. It's a lot of work, and I am still quite busy. I am still in demand as a professional translator and interpreter, as a commentator. I work for the Gorbachev Foundation, and I'm happy to do so. We currently do a lot to put our archive in order and to make it available for historical studies. So there is so much work that I'm not sure that I should set it all aside and devote myself to my book in English. So I'm happy with the way it's doing here in Russia, and let's hope that perhaps the moment will come when this version of the book will also be translated into English. But right now, that's not my priority.
Let me ask one little question about the Gorbachev Foundation. I haven't been following what is going on there. What is it still thriving? Are you able to do progressive activities? Is there any kind of sense of feeling inhibited by the Putin government?
So the last question, no, we're not seeing any kind of pressure from the government. As for how active we are, well, if you look at our website, and it's both in Russian and in English, and compare it with the websites of other nonprofit organizations, you will see that it's a lot more active, that there's a lot more information about what we're doing. Despite the COVID situation, we've been able to continue. We've been able to put some of our work on Zoom, on the web, and I would say that we've been quite successful. We would love to do more, but obviously we do not have a lot of money, so we're doing what we can. Right now, our priority, as I said, is working to improve and organize our archive and to make it available for historians to study. Also, we will continue to work on various publications. We recently published a book about Raisa Gorbachev that contains the entire Russian text of her memoirs that were published in the West, here in Canada and in the States under the title I Hope. So that book and a lot of additional material is in the new book that we've been able to publish. So we are, I would say, despite the fact that we are a modest organization, we are active and we are quite happy with what we've been able to do. Hopefully, with perhaps the COVID pandemic subsiding, we'll be able to do more. We would love to work more with perhaps the students, would like to work more on international conferences. There were ideas and proposals about having a conference in Japan, perhaps one day also in the States. So we are doing what we can, and I'm actually proud of the foundation still going strong and doing more than one would perhaps expect, given the problems and limitations that everyone is now facing.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Gorbachev himself, how is he in terms of health and what he's hoping to still do?
Well, as he likes to say, in terms of health, he is 91 years old, or almost 91 years old. It's an age that not everyone is able to reach. Currently, with the pandemic, he has been under very strict lockdown. We do talk to him on the phone. Even for his daughter, it's not easy to get into the place where he is undergoing this lockdown situation. And it's the government hospital in Moscow. He does require medical care. That's not a secret. He himself is not making it a secret. But as I say, we are constantly in touch with him. He has recently given interviews to the major Russian news agencies, the TASS news agency and the Interfax. He has been quite interested in what is happening, not particularly happy about what's happening, obviously. but still following the news. And whenever he wants to be briefed or updated about the situation, I and other people, both in the foundation and his friends, are always available to keep him posted. Uh, that is, I think, what I can say. And obviously, I'm, I'm not someone to comment on the medical situation day after day, even though we do get requests and questions. How is he doing health-wise, etc. So the answer is, well, he is 91 years old, and his age is something that he has to acknowledge and live.
Well, he's 5 months older than I am. So
Okay.
I kind of know a little bit about what it feels like.
Yeah, but you are definitely still going strong like that guy, Johnny Walker. You know that commercial, right? Johnny Walker, how old was he?
Oh,
Well, there was the commercial for the whiskey, Johnny Walker. Johnny Walker, 100 years old, still going strong.
oh,
So you are like that guy.
well, I'm having a good time, and I certainly hope he is too. And it's
Well, I really admire what you are doing. Not that I will say that I'm able to watch all the material that you send
yeah.
in, all the interviews with some really wonderful people, people who have ideas, who have the will to push those ideas, who are committed to to what needs to be done to save our planet. I really admire all that. Not that I am able to listen to all of that, but I'm actually also using some of that material for my classes in simultaneous interpretation. You know that?
Really?
Yes, exactly. And my students are interpreting it into Russian. And, we also do discuss it a little bit, but of course, the main purpose is not the discussion of the policies that you are discussing, but improving their interpretation skills. And because it's so interesting, and because they're so natural, it's actually a great class, for them to interpret.
I'm just thrilled to think that I had
Absolutely. Yeah, now I found the moment to tell you.
Well, what a wonderful,
That's how it is,
surprise. Thank you so much. It's really delightful to talk to you. And
Okay.
it also makes me a little bit more hopeful. I'm very pessimistic these days, but you don't sound that way. So good for you. That's wonderful.
Well, and good for you that you are so active, and also that you bring in, those very interesting people, and you're able to discuss things that perhaps will make us and you probably a little less pessimistic. Let's hope
Great.
so.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Give my good wishes to everybody in sight, because I haven't been to Moscow in years and years, and I probably won't be again, but I certainly send all good vibes. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that. Okay, and thank you for inviting me.
Bye.
Thank you. It
Wonderful.
was really fun to talk.
I agree. Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week, sometimes more. This is episode 406. You can watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we even post the transcripts there. And when you get to the website, please look around, because we have conversations going there all the time about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. And after you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your thoughts about the show with the other viewers. This is the place for dialogue. So please join in. See you there.